Welcome to the presentation at the Unicoms conference. This is me talking about how to build your own outreach plan for your church or fellowship. It's based on a workshop I ran with my church, Newcastle on Tyne Unitarians, and that in turn grew out of some work we did with the Market-Wise Strategies Research Agency, who ourselves and Stockton Church, the Northern Unitarians, paid to come and do a bit of work with us about how we might better publicise our churches and hopefully encourage more people to join us. So here's what I'm going to be covering. You can see here that we did a small workshop ourselves at Newcastle, just looking at how we might build our own plan. So what I'm going to look at is, this is the overview. I'm going to ask people to think about this step by step. What's the challenge you face? What are your goals? What are you offering to people who might want to come and join you? Who are you offering it to? Who are the people who might want to come and join you? Where will you find them? How are you going to reach them? What works best for them in terms of finding them? How to draw up your plan and how to set a review date for your plan. This is a workshop. I've got quite a few handouts, so at various points I'm going to stop talking and you can start scribbling and indeed talking yourself, so please do swap your own ideas amongst you. So here are the stages of building your outreach plan. I've done the overview. It's about thinking about what challenge you want to meet, and I'll explain what I specifically mean by challenge. By goal, I mean, how are you going to know when you've met the challenge? Again, what is it you're offering people? Who's interested in it? How are you going to reach them? What actions will you take to meet your goal? When are you going to take them? And who's going to do them? And when will you review your plan? As you can see, this is about building the plan step by step, and also about trying to be quite strategic about it, and so that you've actually got something at the end of it, when you know who will do what by when. So I'm starting here with a quote from last year's Unicoms conference. The communications plan must serve the organisational strategy. The outreach plan is not actually the first step in reaching out to people. The first step is in figuring out who you are as a church and fellowship and what you're offering, and this is your challenge.
Is it about what you're actually offering or what you could offer?
That's a really good point. I'd say it's a mixture of both, and the balance between the two will be struck by each individual church or fellowship. I'd say you start by working out what it is you actually are offering. Think about who's going to be attracted to it. And it can also be a good chance to think about what you could be offering. I mean, if there's something you've always wanted to try and you think maybe it's time we try something really new and see if it will attract more people and indeed be more interesting for the people who are already there, because you can't neglect them, then that can be a good opportunity. So this is going into the outreach challenge you face. Think about the big picture, and the words I'd like everyone to remember are being specific, realistic, outward focused and hopeful. When I say specific, what I mean, and we found this out when we were doing our workshop, this is for your church or fellowship's outreach plan. It's not about Unitarianism in the UK or the idea of Unitarianism. It's all about you and what you particularly are offering. One of the things about Unitarianism is, obviously, one of our sayings is belief without dogma, freedom, reason and tolerance. And what that means also, in advertising and communications terms, that's actually a bit of a nightmare, because you can't do any sort of national campaign when everything you're offering nationally is a little bit different in each locality. So what that means is that each church or fellowship has to think about what's special for them and what they're offering. You're not asking people to become Unitarians, you're asking them to become Unitarians with you. So thinking about realistic, again, this is building on past experience. Don't overwhelm yourselves by comparisons with the past. Think about the present. I don't know what everybody else's situation is here, but at Newcastle, our current church building would host about 500 people if we could fill it to capacity. If it makes you feel, interestingly enough, our previous building apparently was even bigger. So I mention this by way of saying, if you start by thinking about how big your building is and how you'll ever get it full, that may not be a good way to go about it. Our churches and fellowships were often founded in a very different era. We all know that things have changed since then. So thinking about how things used to be in the past isn't necessarily going to get us anywhere. We have to think about where we are now. So being outward focused, challenges about what you can do for other people. I suppose what I like to think of here is, there's an old saying that when you go for a job interview, the question you should be able to answer is, why do you want us to give you this job? And the answer isn't, because it will be a great opportunity for me. In church terms, what that means is, or fellowship terms, What that means is it's not a case of we'd like you to come because that's good for us. It's about thinking, what can we do for them? What is it that we're offering that will be a good thing for people we'd like to come and visit us and hopefully join us? And hopeful. I like to finish with this one because it can seem like a really big challenge, but I think the important thing to remember is that we're all going to our churches and fellowships, so are quite a lot of other people. There must be something there that people like, find interesting, and I'd hope enjoy. If it wasn't, we'd all be doing something else. So if you're enjoying it, other people will too. You just have to find them, get out there and let them know that you exist. One question we just had earlier is about whether this is what you're offering now or what you could be offering in the future. I think that's a really good question, and it might be the case that you might not even want to start with the outreach plan. You might want to start with doing a bit of an assessment of where you are and where you're going. I'm mentioning Vision 2020 because we found their 10 ways to grow your congregation evaluation form quite helpful. I've got their website there and I'll be sending the slides around. I've got their email address as well. Something else you might want to do as part of this is just start to think about what resources you've got available in terms of the people, their time, skills you've got amongst you, finance you've got, say, for advertising or doing events, what sort of resources you've got in terms of buildings, whether you've got your own building, you can do whatever you want, or whether you've got to book it in advance. Just some sort of thinking about the practical aspects of this, because when you start getting into outreach, it can require quite a commitment, and it's good to know what you've actually got to commit before you get started.
Can you just ask, Vision 2020?
Yeah.
What is that?
It's a UK Unitarian initiative, essentially a vision for the church for 2020. I'm not a member of that group myself, but they have produced this, and it's about trying to evaluate your church or fellowship, where it's going and what you'd like to do in the future. So thinking about what your outreach goals are, the challenge is, I suppose, the big picture. Where are we? What would we like to do and where are we going? Goals are aim to be a little bit more specific. Your basic goals on your challenge, what would you like to achieve? Be specific, realistic, outward focused and hopeful. Here's us trying to do all of that in the church hall at Newcastle with David, the helpful man from MarketWise, trying to keep us on topic. But we did manage to stay on topic, and at Newcastle and Stockton we decided to set some goals of trying to grow regular attendance at each church by between 5 to 10 new people. And for the Northern Unitarian Association, distinct from the two churches, trying to raise the profile of Unitarianism in the North East. So those are goals in the sense they're specific. There's an old saying, SMART, specific, measurable, achievable, realistic and timely. Essentially just thinking about, we know what we'd like to do, but let's be a little bit specific about this, and let's say we're going to set ourselves this goal, we're going to review it by a certain time, and that's how we'll know we've achieved something. And we thought if we've got 10 people already regularly attending and some others who come in and out, between us, we felt that given the amount of resources we had to do publicity and reach out to people, we probably weren't going to do the sort of blanket advertising that would try and increase it massively. We're probably going to have to go for something quite focused and specific because we only had so much time to spend on it. So we thought if we set ourselves a smaller goal, then given that we can probably do only so many publicity events, of those we'll probably get so many people through the door, and we'll probably only get so many of those actually wanting to stay regularly. That's roughly how many we think we can get. It's not a scientific formula, it was based on an estimation.
What sort of time period was that?
We originally talked about 1 year. We decided in the end to go for 2 years because, well, for Newcastle, though not for so much for Stockton, but for Newcastle the challenge was that we're trying to sell the building at the same time. So to a certain extent our plan was overtaken by events. What are you offering? We've already, I think, talked about this. I think you can see how a lot of this links together. So I said earlier you need to be specific. So this is the time to be really nice about yourselves. What's great about you? What have you got that you like? There must be something, otherwise you wouldn't keep coming. So at Newcastle on Tyne and Stockton, we thought about what have we got that works well for us. We thought about our location. Both churches are in the city centres, although obviously the cities are different and they're in slightly different types of area. Newcastle's is right in the middle of the university campuses, which is great in terms of occasional passing students, but unfortunately a bit rubbish in terms of being part of a residential community. Stockton has more houses near it. We thought about who's already there, roughly what age, what sorts of interests have they got, what what sort of people are they that they find something in us that they like? And obviously when I say they, I mean us, because we all sat around and had a chat about it. And that leads into the other point. What do people who already attend like about it? And that can be absolutely anything. It can be the point that was made earlier about having some space to explore your beliefs. It can be what we've talked about in terms of having a coffee and a biscuit afterwards. I think Adrian's point about what I'm going to call anonymous and non-committal worship is an interesting one and probably worth bearing in mind.
Well, it can be committed. It can be committed.
Yeah.
But they like the fact it's anonymous. They're not being targeted to,
Perhaps,
do this, do that. Join the crew.
Perhaps obligation is the word I'm looking for rather than committed, in the sense that you don't feel that by coming every week you're being obliged to do something you didn't necessarily feel you signed up to.
It's a bit like going to the cinema, isn't it? And then being given a brush and told, well, you've got to sweep up. When you kind of go, well, actually, I've only come to the film. And, and
That's
you do think
point.
some people
really
go, actually, I've only come to the service. That's what I've come for.
I must admit, speaking, slightly getting away from the topic, but speaking as a member of my church's management committee, how exactly we manage the delicate balancing act of not putting off people who, as you say, just really want to come for the film, and we're here to provide that for them, with the same fact that we actually do need a few more people to actually keep the organisation going. That's a whole separate issue.
But one of the things we by and large will not do is spend our money on people. We expect everybody to be a volunteer, and I remember talking about, I think it was one of the districts, somebody was asking me, we have a problem, we don't have a treasurer, this, that and the other. I said, you've got loads of money, pay someone. I said, I don't know what's, if nobody wants to do the job and you've got money, I don't even understand what the issue is.
Solve the problem.
That solves the problem, and it's taken me a minute to think about it. But no, we've got to talk.
But sometimes you do need the external perspective.
Well, but you've got to get people to change their mindset.
Yeah.
That many volunteers are abused within Unitarianism, and I've been in that situation where I've literally been running a congregation because somebody's died, somebody's a widower, all this sort of stuff, and you think, I thought to myself, well, I'm just walking away because I've come here for spiritual refreshment and I've got a second job.
I think that's a really great point. I've gone back to this because going back to the quote, the comms plan must serve the organisational strategy. What you're talking about there is more about the organisation strategy and how you meet the needs you've got. And I think that is actually something, for some churches it might be better if they didn't do their outreach plan before they've solved all those other problems first, or at least made a start toward. Something we have found quite helpful is the Newcastle Council for Voluntary Service. I think most areas have got a council for voluntary service. Ours in Newcastle, we're lucky, it's actually really good. They're very good at providing training and guidance and support. So if you feel you're a bit stuck and you've got problems in running the organisation, we've actually found they've been really helpful. Because what we've been trying to do is we've found there's a bit of an issue where people think they might perhaps want to get involved, but they aren't sure what it involves. And CVS has helped us bridge that gap by providing a bit of training. So they think, well, I can go along for an hour, find out what it might involve, and then I'll have a bit more information to make the decision. So this is what we found, at least what we thought we were offering at Newcastle and Stockton, and I think some of it we've discussed here before. Music and singing, we do love our music, we love a good hymn. Some of us sing it better than others, but we all get stuck in. Feeling of belonging, I think I've mentioned before that that's important to me. Support, individual spirituality, community and friendship, being able to contribute. I know that varies between different churches and fellowships, but we do try and have services where people can bring along something they'd like to read, or even if they don't want to read it themselves, they can just bring along a poem and somebody else will read it if they'd like that. I think other churches and fellowships do other quite similar things as well. Acceptance of all faiths and spiritual stroke philosophical views. I think at Newcastle at the last count, we don't really keep a formal census of this, but I think at the last count we had 2 ex-Methodists, 1 atheist, an agnostic, a humanist, and several other people who just weren't quite really sure. Being valued for who you are, because whilst we've got that bunch of disparate people, we get along well, we're happy with that, nobody tries to convert anybody else. Open mind, coffee and discussion, including the lovely new coffee machine whose arrival was greeted with great joy. Stimulating discussions, happiness, variety of services. I suppose one of the things we've got is we don't have a regular minister, But to paraphrase an old joke, this is our minister this week. If you don't like him, don't worry, we've got another one next week. Peace and tranquility. Most churches like to try and have space for prayer, meditation and thought. And we'd hope a chance to broaden your mind and be exposed to different viewpoints without, I think, the expectation you necessarily have to agree with everything you hear. So I don't know if any of that resonates with people here. I hope at least some of it would. But I'm going to hand out these ideas for longer term, and I think we've already talked about some of it. Things like going to events, hosting events, building partnerships with other organisations. I've put these onto the slightly longer term, simply because from past experience I've found that if you're going to go to something like Newcastle's Green Festival, which we did, it took us about 4 months and a lot of work to actually book the stall, fill out all the paperwork, make sure the insurance was happening, sort the rota out for staffing it, and make sure we had all the materials we needed. So I define that as slightly longer term because, I mean, personally, I could do a new poster in a weekend, and that would be a fairly short-term goal. If we were going to do something like host an event or have a big presence at an event that's already happening, I class that as a little bit longer term, just because you need to make that time commitment. And obviously, we've got limited resources, I'm sure everybody else does. And if we're going to make that commitment, then in a sense we're saying, in 4 months' time, we're going to do this. That means that we can't then spend the resources we're going to spend going to this event on doing something else. An earlier point, somebody asked me how we actually got some new people to Newcastle. I'd love to say I have some sort of magic ingredient that did it, but actually it was that old standby of the Heritage Weekend. We've had a few each time think, actually, the reason we found out later, the reason they came was they were a little bit curious about Unitarianism, and the Heritage Day was a good chance for them to come along, have a wander around and meet people without actually committing to coming to the church. One of the things we've found is that unfortunately we're now almost cursed with the name Church of the Divine Unity, which made a lot of sense back when we were still having theological debates about Unitarianism. It's just an interesting, although usually people will ask about it and we thought, well, it's an interesting little historical background. Essentially, one of our church ministers was having an argument with the bishop, if I remember rightly, and decided that if the Trinitarians could have churches of the Holy Trinity, we were a Church of the Divine Unity. We're moving toward the end of the workshop, and we've had some great ideas. I suppose this is just a sort of list of fairly obvious common sense things to bear in mind. Again, going back to specific, realistic, hopeful. Thinking about what you can achieve with your resources. As I've said, I think one thing we learned is that when you commit to something like the Green Festival, you've got to really commit to it, and you'd better not try and do that and also commit to reaching out to all the amnesty groups in the area at the same time, because you'll end up trying to be in about 3 places at once. And I think, as you've said, there is a real risk that people can get second job syndrome, where they just think, I'm just totally overloaded and I want to stop, and you don't want to get to that point. And again, I guess think about what methods do you think you will work best? Again, for your target audiences in your local area. I mean, as I say, in Newcastle, we've got 2 universities, which is nice for us. I guess if I was doing this workshop with the Great Hucklow Chapel, it would look very different. And I suppose you might also say what will work best for you. If you've got somebody in the congregation who's an absolutely brilliant artist, and somebody else who can do websites, it's going to be different if you say you've got if say your strengths are, we've got one person who's a brilliant writer and another person who just loves going out to debates and talking about things with people. Play to your strengths, but also be aware of where you might have some weaknesses you have to work on. If I was doing this as a formal workshop with an individual church, I'd probably have those sheets of paper labelled things like 3 months, 6 months, 9 months and 10 and 12 months. Those limits aren't set in stone. We just found it was helpful to think in terms of 3-month blocks. I guess if you wanted to say in 10 months' time we'll do the review because that's when everybody's here, and in 12 months everyone's off on holiday, it's a case of what works for you. I've put here, right on each of them, what you'll do, when you'll do it by, and who's going to do it. You could make a start on that on the big pieces of paper there, or you could just start by writing 1 or 2 things that have come into your head that you'd like to try. I mean, for example, I think your point about when there's a by-election, try having an event related to it. Make realistic commitments that may sometimes be a bit of a challenge. This is quite challenging, but you don't want it to be a burden. If it ever gets to the point where somebody feels, I really can't do this and it's weighing me down, you have to try and make sure that person feels they can say that and you can revisit the plan, and it's not too set in stone. And again, I've put there, related to that, don't spread yourselves too thinly. sometimes you've got to sit down and think about how much time everybody's actually got available, how much time it might take to make something work, and just see if you can match those up. And if needs be, the point of having the 3, 6, 9 and 12 month blocks is you can think about, if we can't do everything now, we could try this bit now, that bit later, and the next bit after that. And I've included this picture of the red arrow streaking past the Newcastle on Tyne church, because I think it's a nice image of optimism and progress. And also, I was so pleased I got that photograph, and I like to use it. Please, just keep monitoring progress. Have some informal discussions as and when needed with cake. Have a 6-month review, a 12-month review, and refresh at the end of the 12-month review. Refresh your plan, and that can involve just going through it and saying, we've tried this, which bits have worked, which bits haven't worked. Because I think part of this, unfortunately, we've found can be, you think something will work, you commit a lot of resources to it, and unfortunately it just doesn't. And that's usually not necessarily because you did anything wrong or because it was an awful idea. It just wasn't quite the right idea for this time. That's not necessarily a failure of you or a failure of your church. It just didn't quite work, and sometimes you have to try something else. And I've put the cake on also because something I think we need to remember when we talk about outreach is, as well as trying to reach out to potential new people, you've also sometimes got to nurture the people you've got. I have a friend who will never go to church because of her own beliefs, which is absolutely fine by me, but she did want to comment. I like the look of your church because on Facebook you always seem to be going to Whitby or having some cake or going for a meal or something. And I thought, well, that's actually not a bad perception, because I'd like us to look like a group of people who actually enjoy being together. So I hope that this workshop has been useful for you. I hope we'll continue the discussion throughout the day. And I think the only thing I've finally got to say is, go for it.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.